Sarah had always been drawn to the allure of the old house on Maple Street. It stood alone, nestled between towering oak trees, its Victorian architecture a testament to a bygone era. The house had been vacant for years, the once vibrant paint now faded and peeling, ivy creeping up its walls as if nature was attempting to reclaim it. Despite its dilapidated state, there was something enchanting about the place. When Sarah's parents decided to move to a new town for work, she saw an opportunity. She was 17, old enough to take care of herself, and she managed to convince her parents to let her stay behind until the end of the school year. She would live in the old house, which her parents had inherited from a distant relative. It was a perfect arrangement. She would have her independence, and her parents wouldn't have to worry about uprooting her during her senior year. The first few days in the house were exciting. Sarah reveled in the freedom, exploring every nook and cranny of the sprawling mansion. She marveled at the intricate woodwork, the grand staircase, and the dusty old furniture covered in white sheets. She felt like she had stepped into another world, a world of mystery and forgotten stories. It wasn't long before Sarah began to notice strange things happening in the house. At first, it was little things. A door that she was sure she had closed would be open, or a light that she had turned off would be on. She dismissed these occurrences as her own forgetfulness, a product of her excitement and the newness of her surroundings. But as the days went by, the strange happenings became more frequent and more unsettling. One night, as she was lying in bed reading, she heard footsteps in the hallway. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened intently, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. She tried to convince herself that it was just the house settling, but a nagging fear began to take root in her mind. The next day, she found an old journal in the attic. It belonged to a woman named Eliza, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Sarah read with fascination about Eliza's life, her hopes, and her fears. But as she delved deeper into the journal, she discovered something disturbing. Eliza wrote about strange occurrences in the house, much like the ones Sarah was experiencing. She spoke of shadows moving in the corners of her vision, of whispers in the night, and of a presence that seemed to watch her every move. Sarah tried to brush off the journal entries as the ramblings of a woman from a different time, but the occurrences in the house grew more intense. One night, she awoke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost indistinguishable, but it was there. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, surrounding her in a cocoon of unsettling murmur. Terrified, she pulled the covers over her head and tried to block out the sound. Eventually, the whispers faded, and she fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, she found scratch marks on her bedroom door, as if something had been trying to get in. Sarah's fear grew with each passing day. She started avoiding certain parts of the house, especially the basement, which gave her an inexplicable sense of dread. She tried to stay out of the house as much as possible, spending long hours at the library or with friends. But she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, that the house was alive and aware of her presence. Determined to find out what was happening, Sarah began to research the history of the house. She discovered that Eliza had died under mysterious circumstances, her body found at the bottom of the grand staircase. Some said she had fallen, while others whispered that she had been pushed. The house had a dark history, with several other unexplained deaths and disappearances over the years. Sarah's research led her to an old newspaper article about a séance held in the house shortly after Eliza's death. The medium had claimed to contact Eliza's spirit, who warned that the house was cursed, that an evil presence lurked within its walls. The medium's warning had been dismissed as superstition, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to it. Desperate for answers, Sarah decided to hold her own séance. She gathered candles, a Ouija board, and a few friends who were willing to help. They sat in a circle in the parlor, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah explained what she had found in her research and her experiences in the house. Her friends were skeptical but intrigued. They began the seance, holding hands and calling out to the spirits. At first, nothing happened. The air was still and silent, the only sound the crackling of the candles. Then, slowly, the planchette on the Ouija board began to move. It spelled out a single word, leave. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She asked who they were speaking to, and the planchette moved again, spelling out, Eliza. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she asked what Eliza wanted. The planchette moved quickly, spelling out, danger. Before they could ask another question, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. The room plunged into darkness, and the temperature dropped sharply. They heard a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Panic set in, and Sarah and her friends scrambled to relight the candles. When they finally managed to do so, they saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and menacing, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The figure began to move toward them, its steps slow and deliberate. Sarah and her friends bolted from the parlor, running through the house in a blind panic. They could hear the figure behind them, its footsteps echoing through the hall. They ran up the stairs, hoping to find safety in one of the bedrooms. They barricaded themselves inside, pushing furniture against the door. The figure reached the door, pounding on it with a force that shook the entire room. Sarah could hear it growling and snarling, its rage palpable. She knew they couldn't stay in the room forever, but she had no idea how to escape. In a moment of clarity, Sarah remembered the journal. Eliza had mentioned a hidden passage in the house, a secret way out. She frantically searched the room, looking for any sign of the passage. She found it behind an old wardrobe, a narrow door that led to a hidden staircase. Sarah and her friends squeezed through the door and descended the staircase. The passage was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. They could hear the figure pounding on the door above them, its fury growing with each passing second. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves. Sarah's dread returned, but she forced herself to keep moving. They navigated the labyrinthine basement, searching for a way out. Finally, they found a door that led outside. They burst into the cool night air, gasping for breath. They didn't stop running until they reached the street. They looked back at the house, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but Sarah knew it was still there, lurking in the shadows. Sarah and her friends went to the police, but their story was met with skepticism. The house was searched, but no evidence of the figure was found. The scratches on Sarah's bedroom door were dismissed as the work of an animal. The journal was taken as evidence, but the police didn't put much stock in its contents. Sarah's parents returned home, concerned for her safety. They agreed to move her to a different house, far away from the old mansion on Maple Street. Sarah was relieved to leave the house behind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the evil presence was still watching her, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Sarah tried to put the events behind her and move on with her life. She finished high school and went on to college, but the memories of the old house haunted her. She often found herself looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. She kept Eliza's journal, hoping to one day find answers to the mystery of the house. She delved deeper into the history of the mansion, uncovering more stories of strange occurrences and unexplained deaths. The house had a dark legacy, one that seemed to reach out across the years, ensnaring those who dared to enter its walls. Years passed, and Sarah thought she had finally put the events behind her. She married, had children, and built a life for herself. But the pull of the old house never truly left her. She felt a strange connection to it, a need to uncover the truth once and for all. One day, she received a letter from a historian who had read her story. He had uncovered new information about the house, information that could finally explain the strange occurrences. Sarah knew she had to go back, to face the house and whatever lurked within its walls. She returned to Maple Street, her heart heavy with a mix of fear and determination. Emily was used to the late-night shifts, but tonight felt different. The night staff had been unusually quiet, and the nurses who had handed her the keys to the new ward seemed relieved to be rid of them. There were whispers about the forgotten ward, but Emily hadn't paid much attention. As a dedicated resident, she had brushed off the ghost stories and urban legends as mere superstitions. The ward was on the top floor, a place that had been closed off for years before being refurbished. The paint was fresh, the floors polished, and everything seemed in pristine condition, except for a palpable sense of dread that clung to the air. Emily shook her head, trying to dispel the creeping unease. She had a job to do. As she walked through the long, narrow corridor, the only sound was the echo of her footsteps. She passed empty rooms with doors slightly ajar, their interiors dark and shadowed. She felt a shiver, but attributed it to the cold air that seemed to seep through the walls. Her assignment was straightforward: monitor the patients in the ward and ensure that everything ran smoothly. The first sign that something was wrong came when Emily entered room 7. The room was empty, save for a single bed and a small, dusty window. The light from the corridor barely penetrated the gloom. She was about to turn on the light when she heard a faint, plaintive cry. It was the sound of a child, soft, trembling, and filled with despair. Emily froze, her hand hovering over the light switch. The cry seemed to come from all around her, echoing off the walls. She took a deep breath and stepped into the room, the floor creaking under her weight. The room was as empty as she had left it, and the cry had stopped. She shook her head again, trying to dismiss it as a figment of her imagination. As the hours dragged on, Emily continued her rounds. The ward was quiet, too quiet, and the silence grew heavier with each passing minute. The occasional flicker of the lights did nothing to ease her growing sense of unease. Each room she entered felt colder than the last, and she could not shake the feeling that she was being watched. Around 3 a.m., as she walked past the nurse's station, she noticed a file on the desk that she had not seen before. Curious, she picked it up and began to flip through its contents. The file was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. It contained records of patients who had been admitted to the ward decades ago, names, dates, and brief medical history. One name caught her eye: Henry Thompson. According to the records, Henry Thompson had been admitted to the ward for what was described as experimental treatment. The notes were sparse but mentioned several troubling incidents: unexplained pain, delirium, and eventually, disappearance. Emily's heart raced as she realized that the file was dated from a period when the ward was notorious for unethical practice. As she continued reading, she discovered more about the experiments conducted on patients, unauthorized and brutal procedures performed without consent. The file mentioned a Dr. Victor Hargrove, the head physician at the time, whose methods had been shrouded in secrecy. Emily's skin crawled as she realized the implications of what she was reading. These were not just old hospital records, they were documents of human suffering. The night wore on, and Emily's anxiety grew. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the occasional, inexplicable noise, footsteps echoing behind her, whispers in the dark, heightened her fear. Each time she looked back, the corridor was empty, but the sense of being followed was almost At around 5 a.m., she decided to investigate the history of the ward further. She accessed the hospital's digital archives, searching for any information related to Dr. Victor Hargrove. What she found was a disturbing account of his downfall. He had been dismissed from the hospital after a series of patient complaints and unexplained deaths. The records mentioned that he had vanished mysteriously, never to be found again. Emily was deep in her research when she heard it, the sound of a child's laughter, high-pitched and mocking, coming from down the hall. She stood up abruptly, her heart pounding. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, as if someone, or something, was playing a cruel game. She followed the sound to room 9, where the laughter abruptly stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open, only to find the room empty. The air was freezing, and she could see her breath in the dim light. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, and the temperature dropped even further. Emily's breath came in visible puffs, and she felt a cold, invisible presence brush against her. The lights flickered violently, and the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and twist. Emily turned around, her pulse racing, and saw a figure in the corner of the room, a gaunt, ghostly man with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. It was Dr. Victor Hargrove. "Why are you here?" Emily managed to gasp, her voice trembled. The apparition's smile widened. "This ward is mine," he whispered. "And now, so are..." As the figure advanced, the room seemed to close in on her. Emily scrambled to the door, but it was locked tight. The laughter returned, louder and more frantic, as if the walls themselves were alive with torment. Desperate, Emily tried to remember the old records she had read. There was a mention of a way to banish the spirits, an ancient ritual involving the ward's old journal, hidden somewhere in the building. She had to find. With renewed determination, she fought her way through the oppressive atmosphere and made her way to the hospital's archive room. The laughter followed her, and the air grew heavier with each step. She rifled through old files and dusty shelves until she found an old, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. As she opened the journal, the room seemed to quiet down. The pages were filled with cryptic notes and detailed accounts of the experiments conducted by Dr. Hargrove. Emily found the ritual described in a faded, scrawling hand. It required certain objects from the ward and a specific incantation. Gathering the necessary items from the hospital and following the instructions carefully, Emily performed the ritual. The atmosphere in the ward grew increasingly tense, the oppressive weight of fear pressing down on her. As she completed the final incantation, the lights flickered one last time before everything went eerily silent. The spirit of Dr. Hargrove vanished, and the temperature returned to normal. Emily was exhausted but relieved. She knew the ward's dark chapter had been closed, at least for now. The hospital administration decided to shut down the ward once again, and Emily's experience was kept secret, an unsettling reminder of the darkness that had once lingered within its wall. Emily's shift ended with the dawn, and as she left the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. The forgotten ward had claimed its victims, but Emily had escaped, scarred but alive, with a story that would haunt her for the rest of her days.